Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel discussion on trade wars. My name is Subbarao. I'm a visiting fellow at ISS. And to use standard NUS phraseology, it's my pleasure and privilege to be the chairman for this afternoon's session. But when I'm using NUS phraseology, I'm not just paying homage to a tradition, but it's very important. Today's topic of trade wars is interesting, relevant, exciting. And to discuss all that, we have four very knowledgeable and expert panelists. Trade wars are our daily staple. The other day I was in a taxi. I don't usually talk to taxi drivers, although they tend to chat you up, but this guy was so insistent, he chatted me up. In the 20 minutes ride, we got to know each other's life stories. So in about 10 minutes, he told me about himself, and he told me that his wife died and children live away, he lives alone. And I said, what do? You watch a lot of movies. He said, yeah, I used to watch a lot of movies, not anymore. I watch news these days. I said, how can you watch news for 24 hours? He said, it's so exciting. It's like soap opera. Trump makes it so exciting and interesting. And then he asked me, oh, you're at NUS. Can you tell me, if China has to import soybean, they can't do it anymore from America. Can India supply? And then he asked me another question, which surprised me even more. When do you think China will retaliate against America? Imagine a taxi driver using that word retaliate. So it's become so much of our daily staple that if and when the trade wars finish, we'll have withdrawal symptoms. But to discuss the strategies and the way forward, we have four panelists: Dr. Pallet, Kimberly Borthwaite, Deborah Elms, and Raymond Krishnan. We will dive into the discussion straight away, but before we do that, I want to take a poll. How many of you believe that trade wars will ebb away in the next 6 months because Trump and Xi will have to find a face-saving formula? Only two. The rest, I take it, believe that trade wars will fester and go on forever. Okay.
Yes.
It'll be a challenge for the panelists to change that opinion. So let me turn to the panelists straight away. First to Dr. Amitendra Pallet, who is a senior research fellow at ISS. Because we see him every day in the corridors and we have lunch with him twice a week, we tend to underestimate his expertise. But he's one of the leading experts on trade deals and trade economics. I was in Shenzhen last year, China Development Institute, and my people there were quite happy to have me. And one woman told me, oh, you're from ISS. I said, yeah. Dr. Pallet is your colleague. I said, yes. Oh my God, can you please recommend and get him here sometime? So they were, not so much that I was there, but because I was Dr. Pallet's colleague. So, Amit, my question to you is this. There's a view that the trade wars are just a manifestation of a deeper conflict between America and China for technological dominance, for economic power, political influence, military supremacy. People say America feels threatened by China 2025. This morning somebody was telling me at breakfast, a scientist, that what China is doing in terms of innovation and technology industrial scale, absolutely amazing, impressive. America is threatened by that China 2025. America is threatened by BRI. America is threatened by China's exercises in the South China Sea. America is threatened by China cozying up to Russia. So what we see as trade war is not really a trade war, but something much bigger, a much wider, deeper conflict. If that is indeed the case, the trade negotiations will not end this trade war, right? So can you reflect on that?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rao, for that flattering introduction in the first place. And secondly, for raising a question which I think is kind of on the minds of most, not just us who are trying to find a business out of trade war, but also on the minds of people like the taxi driver that you alluded to, that is it going to end? Is the world going to be same as it was before, maybe 2.5 years ago? Or is it going to be something which is going to lead to actually a very different global scenario? Before I come to that, I want to make one distinction. I think there is a narrative that is being pushed by several analysts that the US-China trade war is supposed to be the next Cold War. Mm-hmm. I disagree with that. I disagree with that because historically the Cold War was actually based on ideology and ideological positions. What we are seeing now has actually nothing to do with ideology. Rather, more importantly, it's got something to do with a common ideology, and that's the ideology of business. Having said that, I don't think the trade war, the way we are describing it right now, is going to end. And to answer your question upfront, I think this is, if one can describe it using, let's say, somewhat of a commoner's phrase, this is going to be a fight to the finish. This is actually a battle for global economic supremacy, and that global economic supremacy is a fundamental for a number of other leverages. The first of it is the ability of countries to sustain over the generations and decades that are to follow. It is very important for exercising the kind of geopolitical influence that both US and China want to exert through the rest of the world. And this is something which is not going to end. We can discuss that. We can have what you alluded to as, face-saving deals on important global platforms. But I think the war actually is much, much more than tariffs. Tariffs are just not even the tip of the iceberg. Tariffs are just a beginning. It's probably just the first chapter in a very prolonged saga that we are going to see over the next 5, 10, 15, even 20 years across generations that's going to pan out. We can discuss more on that.
So the Cold War festered for about...
It's on.
It's on. Okay. The Cold War festered for about 40 years. And you think this is much wider, perhaps it festered for much longer.
I think I won't put a number to how long it is going to last, but I think it's going to continue in the form in which we are getting to see it, because there are going to be more and more layers coming up in this war. Okay. The first part of what we see are with respect to tariffs. This is increasingly going to move on to other specters of commercial and international engagement, including the movement of people, including technology management and guarding of secrets, including broader roles that the two countries have in their economic presence in various parts of the world. You alluded to subjects like the Belt and Road, for example. So those are all, in a sense, maybe not at the core, but certainly at the periphery, connected to the kind of hostilities that we are witnessing.
Oh, thank you, Amit, for that big picture. I next want to turn to Dr. Deborah Elms, who is the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center and comes with very distinguished credentials both in the academia and the profession. She worked in the academia, intensive project work on every alphabet combination of trade deals, TPP, RCEP, AEC, USMCA. She is a senior fellow in the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry's Trade Academy, serves on very prestigious and influential committees and advisory bodies, and in the real world has expertise in analyzing, understanding, and importantly, promoting understanding of world trade, and writes a blog called Talking Trade. And on a regular basis, she advises governments and corporations on trade policies. So your expertise is going to be very, very valuable in the unfolding scenario. My big picture question to you is this. We had the G20 meeting of central bank governors and finance ministers a couple of weeks ago in Japan, and the communique at the end of that was very disappointing because it had all the hallmarks of leaders who were unable to agree. There was no reference to fighting protection. There was no reference to reducing trade tensions. And we gather that there was acrimonious scenes behind the doors. So that's cause for a lot of anxiety because over the last 10 years since the global financial crisis, the G20 has been, in some sense, the last man standing. The World Bank, the IMF, WTO, the BIS have all been found wanting, but the G20 as an informal body has come up as one organization, one institution that can just solve the world problems. But this communique has been disappointing. So my questions to you are, first, what do you read of this? Second, are we forever condemned to trade wars? And third, what's your prognosis for the coming summit between Trump and Xi in Japan later this month?
Well, those are some tough questions. So let me start with the G20 question. I think it's kind of interesting that you found it disappointing. I guess it's a measure of where we're at, how you interpret the G20 answer. I actually was a little surprised on the opposite direction. I was a little heartened by the G20 statements, especially on the trade side, because they had, first of all, they had a statement. Okay, so this is a reflection of where we're at, right? The fact that they had a statement, I thought was like, hallelujah, there was a statement. And the reason why that was so exciting is that heading into the weekend of the G20 meetings on trade in particular, that was an open question whether they were going to get a statement at all. And the reason why it was an open question is because there was one large economy in particular that did not even want to have the word inclusive in the statement because they could not agree on the word inclusive trade. I mean, really, if you can't say that trade should be inclusive, that's like arguing against motherhood or fatherhood. I mean, this is just, really. So the fact that they managed to have a statement, I thought was amazing. And actually, the contents of the statement, especially on the trade side, the finance statement was a bit more muted because, they're bankers and they're a bit more cautious by nature, right? Because they're regulators and they're finance people and they're cautious. The trade side was interesting to me because it was a little more, not only did they have a statement, but it's a little more ambitious, and it actually included some potentially interesting outcomes on the digital side, because the Japanese, who are the hosts, have some hope of pushing some agenda items forward. So I think how you saw the statement in part depends on the yardstick, and the yardstick at the moment is so small that if you can have a statement, it's a occasion for a party. Now, is that always how we're going to be? I mean, I hope not, because on behalf of companies and consumers, we need trade to continue because it matters to all of us. It matters to all of us as consumers, and it matters to all of us who are companies. You need to have trade continue. So that's disappointing whenever there is conflict along the way. Now, how much conflict do we actually see on the ground? And I know that my colleague here is going to talk about this from a slightly different perspective, how much is actually taking place and how much is actually disrupted. I mean, clearly at the rhetorical side, an enormous amount of disruption and more disruption on the way as these things start to fall out. So as an example, U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods in List 3, those of you who are way down in the weeds will know what I'm talking about, but List 3, which is the latest escalation of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, has just started to take effect. And as that starts to trickle through the economy, you see more impact from that. But for the U.S. and China in particular, because their domestic economies are both very large, the implications of a trade war between the two of them for their own economies is actually relatively modest because their own domestic economies are so large and because trade as a percentage of their own economies is relatively modest. They are surprisingly insulated from their own trade war. Now that is unfortunate for everyone else because smaller economies that are tied into these larger economies like Singapore actually bear a bigger price for the larger economies fighting with one another. So, in the grand scheme of things, the trade war is problematic, not just for the US or China or companies in those two locations, but especially for peripheral countries that are caught in a trade war, not of their own making, that has upsides and downsides. So, and this will be the last thing that I think I should say because we're just trying to make opening statements, but I would just say that for Asia and ASEAN in particular, you often hear a narrative, especially by governments, who seem to be way enthusiastic about the outcome of the trade war. It's going to be fantastic for ASEAN. We're going to win as all of these companies from China relocate and be somewhere else. And, of course, they're all going to come swooping into ASEAN. It'll be fantastic. The reality of that is not nearly so great, especially in the short run, because in the short run, the damage can be high for trade-dependent economies, especially like Singapore, where a lot of Singapore and other ASEAN output is part of inputs into China to go into U.S. final products. So that supply chain that is very tight and complicated, when you disrupt that, that gets complicated for ASEAN and for Singapore. And so anything that damages that in any way creates knock-on implications for this part of the world. In the medium term, longer term, maybe it's great for some parts, some pockets, some sectors in the economy in ASEAN/Singapore. But the short-term implications for many firms is going to be tough because this is the supply chain that's evolved over years, and the disruption is difficult. In the medium term, it might be beneficial for some places, but capturing the supply chain out of China is harder than it sounds. I mean, it's one thing to move a factory. It's another thing to move all of the ancillary parts of a supply chain. So it's not just the moving of the factory, it's all of the, who does the packaging and who does the boxes and who does the labels and who does the trucking and who does the trucking from the factory to the port and all of that stuff also has to be in place. Otherwise, you can't actually move the factory very well, and you can't do what you used to do in China relatively seamlessly. So it's not just the sort of, I'm going to open a factory, which, by the way, is very difficult to do in lots of ASEAN countries where it can take you 3 years and a lot of lawyers and you never get it accomplished. But even after you open it, the running of that can be much more complicated than people imagined. So the trade war is complicating life in ways that people didn't anticipate. And it's not just a US-China phenomenon. It's increasingly having spillover implications. And in fact, more problems for countries in this region than people, I think, maybe anticipate. So it's not just something happening over there that's like a soap opera, which is, I understand why it feels like a soap opera, but the implications are also real and will be increasingly felt in places that don't expect to feel them personally. So it's not just like a reality TV show that you can watch from afar and say, isn't this entertaining? It's actually got implications for you in ways that you might not imagine or don't see or feel maybe quite as keenly as you will as this goes on.
Thank you. Thank you for that big picture. And it's interesting you say that we must draw assurance from the fact that there was indeed a communique at all. But, in all these international organizations, as you very well know, there's an entire secretariat working on the communique even before the conference has started. And they agonize over every word, every nuance, every punctuation mark, etc. So a lot of people will be put out of job if there is no communique at all. But, you answered more questions than I've asked, but I still have one question. If you had only 1 minute to advise Trump and Xi about what they should do, why they should come to an agreement, in 1 minute, what will you tell them?
At this point, so I know lots of people are holding their breath for this meeting that is supposed to take place. I'm not sure that it will take place. And if it does take place, the best scenario I can imagine is that they agree to restart talks. But I think to restart talks, they have to throw out the existing agreement that was on the table and start over. because I don't think that the existing agreement that is in place is going to be viable. And so that means months' worth of work out the window, start over with a new paradigm, with a new team at a lower level, because they were doing sort of in government principles, so they were at much too high a level in these negotiations. And so when it breaks down, you're stuck, because you can't. The only way to solve this is to go to the very top and have the very top fix this, and that's not viable either. So you really need to go down a level and have officials at the, official level. That's why they're officials. Officials should solve this problem by working out the parts of this agreement together, so that if there's an issue, they could escalate it, they could de-escalate it, but at least then you're not stuck at the top, and only one way to go is to the very top, and then you have a mess. So I think they have to throw out what they have, start over again, and that is going to be hard to commit to, and especially, I think, hard to commit to this month, because I don't think either side sees any benefit from doing so right now. Both of them think they're going to win. And so when two sides think that they're going to win from the strategy they're on, there is no incentive for either one of them to agree to throw out the existing playbook and say, let's start over with a new one.
That's not very reassuring, but perhaps realistic. Let me turn to our next panelist, Dr. Raymond Krishnan, who is the Director for Corporate Advisory in the Asian Trade Center. That title does not do full justice to what he actually does. He has been a career devoted to logistics and supply chain management. I think this is what sees that there's Coca-Cola available on Mount Everest and in the Arctic. He advises corporates, including multinationals in Asia and Pacific and around the world, on managing trade compliance and supply chain management, and has first-hand expertise in responding to trade wars, economic downturns, and black swan events, as he told me. So, Raymond, if China has been the factory of the world, that model has come out of the global value chain model, the GVC model. And today, the GVC model is at the heart of this trade war, and that GVC model is being upended by China and the US. But there is a view put forward by people who have done analysis, who have looked at the numbers, that the GVC production model overestimates the US-China trade imbalance, which is Trump's grouse. Data from the OECD suggests that about 35 to 40% of the bilateral trade deficit between US and China is not value added in China, but value added outside. The components which are shipped from elsewhere in Asia, perhaps to China, and assembled and shipped outside as finished products from China to the US. If that is the case, do you think Trump is actually reading the wrong message and believing that he's being wrong when there is indeed no wrong at all?
Well, I think I won't start with the Trump. I'll leave that to Deborah. She has a lot to say about that. But when you look at global value chains, I'll give you a couple of examples. So up until about 5 years ago, I used to run logistics and trade compliance for a US chemical company. And China, at that point in time, in the Asia-Pacific region, was our largest market. And then a few things happened, and this is used to be a Fortune 500 chemical company, and a few things happened, and we then decided to do 3 things in China with 3 different business units. The first thing we did was we closed down one business unit that accounted for 60% of what we sold. So being the person working logistics or supply chain, I panicked, that 60% of our market, in our largest market, being closed down and we're just saying we're not selling it anymore. And the reason why we shut down was because of IPR. Chinese companies started copying our product and could sell it 10 cents on the dollar. So that was one product. The other product we had was rare earth. I'm sure many of you in this room would be familiar with rare earth. And China, again, cornered the market on rare earth production. And what we then did was we called rare earth something else. We called it RV27. We gave it a code name. And then we continued shipping it out of China. So we took advantage of that situation. And the third thing that we did was in our medium range product, which was specialty chemicals, we continued selling at a premium in China. We acquired a few companies and we grew the business. So one business unit that accounted for 60% of our business in China, we shut down and we stopped selling. A lot of our employees were very concerned. They said, we're going to lose our jobs. There's going to be significant impact to us, so on and so forth. Where we could capitalize on the opportunity with rare earth with China, we did. And this is, again, an American company, yeah? And the third thing that we did was grow, and we did mergers and acquisitions. So when we talk about global value chains and China being the factory of the world, that is correct. But I think when we look at global value chains, it's one company or companies looking at where there's opportunity to leverage off disruptions. And disruptions not just in the sense of trade war. And this is a constant discussion we have in the office when we talk about this trade war. The first thing is the trade war is business as usual. Why I say business as usual? If you're running a supply chain or a global value chain, as you term it, or if you're working in a business that makes stuff, not just talking about stuff and not just services, but if you actually make stuff, there's always going to be a disruption. There is either going to be disruptions through black swan events. There could be an earthquake, there could be an explosion or a volcano that takes place and that disrupts your global value chain. So, or it could be, in this instance, this trade war that's taking place. So anyone who works in global value chains or anyone who works in a business, it is actually business as usual. This disruption, there's nothing as constant as change. This disruption is constant. And with China, for example, you're absolutely correct. I think the number you mentioned was 35% of inputs into products that are manufactured in China are actually supplied outside of China. So what we're going to see is, we're going to see supply chains evolving. This is a good thing. Yes, as Deborah said, there will be short-term impacts and effects, but it is also a positive thing from my perspective. Why? Because A, you should be looking at how your supply chains are structured and evolve. B, it's actually through the sort of chaos and disruption where there is the opportunity. I worked in supply chain my entire career, or most of my career, and wherever there's been disruption is where we've made the most business. When a shipping line goes out of business a few years ago, it was the best quarter. I was working for NOL at the time, or APL, our national carrier. That was our best quarter because why? One of our biggest competitors went bankrupt. So from disruption is actually opportunity. And what we're going to see is we're going to see supply chains evolving, shifting outside of China potentially. But like Deborah said, not overnight. It's not easy to do. There are many, many factors that you have to consider. But it is an opportunity.
What you're saying is somewhat reassuring because you're telling us that this trade war is okay because global production is used to disruptions. This is just another disruption to which countries will adjust. Perhaps later I'll have, or the audience might have questions about how South Asia, which is of interest to us, might respond to this opportunity that's being thrown open by trade wars. Thank you, Raymond. I now want to turn to our final but important panelist, Dr. Kimberly Borthwaite, who is, as the community lead of global trade and investment at the World Economic Forum, is the Davos woman. at the intellectual center of trade, finance, business, economics. WEF has its finger on the pulse of what's happening around the world. Kimberly worked earlier in the OECD and the International Center for Trade and Development. We all know that the WEF has been very influential in generating and communicating ideas, and the WEF is able to do that because of professionals like Kimberly who help us move up the intellectual value chain from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. She blogs regularly on the WEF platform, something that we value very much in ISAS, because our business, we believe, is also generating ideas and communicating them. My question to you is on the global trade rules. Over the last 70 years, since the end of the Second World War, the world has seen a phenomenal expansion of global trade. Global trade has expanded faster than global output in practically every year except a few. And this has been made possible because of a number of factors: decline in transport costs, reduction in tariffs, vigorous cross-border movement for a long time of people and ideas. But importantly, it's been made possible because of multilateral trading system rules. And those rules are being upended now. Those rules have nurtured and promoted a global trading system that is under attack now. So Trump has been, so many adjectives, has been arbitrary, whimsical, eccentric, impetuous, unpredictable, venal, and my English fails me there, but you can add several adjectives. He's not gone just against China. Last week, there was this threat of tariffs against Mexico because Mexico is not acting on the immigrant issue. It's gone against allies, both against Canadian meat imports and against European car imports. So my question to you is this: are global trade rules, as we know them, finished? And if so, what comes next?
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and very good to be with you all here today. I could answer your question very simply, which would be yes. Next question. I'll elaborate a little bit. So I do think, and this is personal view here, not necessarily the West view, yes, I do think trade rules no longer have the same context than they did a year or even a couple years ago. I think we are living in a new context. And then I think an important question to ask is then, what comes next? Partly also because of the views that have been elaborated on this panel. How do you plan? How do you strategize? What do you do with that context? I'm very lucky to manage a group of about 20 experts from around the world, of which several on this panel are part of that. And one of the things that they did this year is put together a set of 4 scenarios to sort of map what the future of trade could possibly look like. So these are 4 potential scenarios. I'm going to run you through them quickly, and then there'll be a quiz, so I hope you're all listening. We are in a university. So these 4 scenarios. The first one, well, first I should say these scenarios are plotted on a 2x2 axis, and the 2x2 variables are high ease of trade, low ease of trade, and then over here we have unilateral moves, so governments making moves without coordinating with each other, unilateral, like tariffs, for example. And on the other end of that spectrum, you have intergovernmental collaboration. So that would be WTO coordination, for example. So in the first box over here, with high ease of trade and high degree of cooperation, we have open international rules. So this is one potential future scenario. We could see a return or even an evolution in the way the WTO works. Countries could agree to a revitalized WTO. They could pursue several new flexible multilateralism through different plurilateral talks on e-commerce and so on and so forth. That would possibly see efficient allocation of capital across value chains and possibly productivity gains. Moving down to the competing coalition scenario. So this is where we would have a high degree of cooperation, but low ease of trade. And particularly that's because the high degree of cooperation would be among regional blocs that would operate in a rather fortress-like fashion. These regional trading blocs would be linked to larger economies that would largely set the rule and then apply that to the smaller economies around them. that would probably lead to fragmented value chains, probably some political management of trade, very bifurcated investment flows between the US and China going, picking where they want to invest and going that way. And then for business, a high cost of switching between blocks. So you would see business very much concentrate on one regional block or maybe two at most, and that would be that. That could possibly lead to some stalling in the rate of innovation that we might otherwise have seen. So moving across to the technological disruption scenario. This would be where there's high ease of trade, but countries are making unilateral moves and absolutely not willing to engage in any form of bilateral or intergovernmental collaboration on common issues. In that context, we would expect that there could be, or one scenario could be that there would be these low barriers due to very fast digital and other forms of innovation, such as 3D printing, paperless trade, blockchain, all these kind of AI, all these kind of new technologies that would massively ease trade. So business would find a way, and the cost would come down. However, unilateral competition between countries would create a relatively unstable global environment. So you wouldn't necessarily know in this global context, is something today, is the regulatory environment that I operate in today, or even the geopolitical environment that I operate in today, going to be the same tomorrow. Fragmented data governments in particular might raise cybersecurity costs. So I think we're already seeing some trends along those lines. Furthermore, unilateral competition in the area of technology would create economic espionage incentives, and you would also see power-based resolution of conflicts between countries, protecting their key industries. And lastly and importantly, high cost of entry for SMEs, particularly around certain technologies. So probably winner-takes-all mechanisms working, having a strong effect in this box. And then lastly, the sovereignty-first scenario. So here it would be a high degree of unilateralism and very low ease of trade. And in this scenario, what we would see is a normalization of trade wars being used as a geostrategic weapon. Business would indeed probably start planning for that, which probably would result in lower investment, lower FDI, some unwinding of value chains, certainly some unwinding of cooperative arrangements, so FTAs possibly falling apart that were there previously, rising barriers to trade, high consumer costs, possibly lower employment, heightened risk of international conflict, especially as there would be no orderly means for dispute resolution, and importantly, as the economic phone lines started to shutter between countries, so too the peace and security phone lines might also shutter. So that was the run-through. I'll hold this up. Now for the pop quiz. Who thinks that we are moving to the open international rules future? Please raise your hand. Good. Okay. Good to see. Who thinks we are moving to the competing coalitions future? Please raise your hand. Okay. It's about half, a third. Third. Who thinks we are moving to technological disruption? There's still 2/3 of you to vote. So another third. And who thinks we're moving to sovereignty first? Okay, so there's a missing third, but good news is that we're not down here in this box at the moment. All right, so I'll leave it there, and much to be debated for the remainder of this panel. But I do think which scenario ultimately ends up playing out, I don't think is necessarily what we would say in Geneva, a fait accompli. It's not just necessarily a force that's in motion. I do think that context can be changed, and actors, both public and private, can manage which scenario they may wish to see playing out. There's a degree to which they can manage that, and there's also a degree to which they can strategize based on the scenario that is playing out before them. Thanks.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you for that very interesting quiz. It struck me that many of them believe that we're moving towards more cooperation. I would have thought that we're actually moving away from cooperation from what we see in the G20 and all that. Anyway, at the end of the first round of big picture questions, we have a worldview, at least arising from this panel. Amit saying that the trade wars are much wider than just trade wars, and the US-China conflict is different from the Cold War of the US and Soviet Union, and also telling us that we'll have to live with the trade wars for a long, long time to come. And Deborah, continuing on that less than optimistic note, telling us again that we have to, trade wars are going to be there for a long time, and that we're to work from bottom up to find an agreement, and it cannot be done at the leaders' level. A ray of optimism from Raymond, saying that trade wars are just another disruption that the world has faced and addressed in the past. So we will win, or we will move on. We don't have to be unduly worried. And Kimberly, being very objective and detached, and giving us a picture of where we are heading, of the 4 scenarios and where we might be heading. At this time, questions, comments from the audience? Yes, Dipinder.
Thank you. I must admit I'm more than a bit struck by the complete absence of a view of the bottom, the resistance to globalization. This entire conversation seems to have been constructed as if it's a debate or a fight amongst the Davos man or the World Economic Forum man. There's been a groundswell of resistance to trade. The classic textbook example is we all benefit and some lose out, and then you can pay off the losers through domestic social policy to form an agreement, a concord. The last 2 decades, you started with Vancouver, Seattle, and Paris, elsewhere. What's been coming out, emerging very strongly through data and other evidence is that we seem to have reached the limits almost of trade, and domestic social policy or redistributive policies seem to be incapable of redressing that. And you look at the demonstrations in Paris, the rise of Trump, the rise of Brexit, what's masked as the anti-immigrant stance, all of this is pointing towards a growing groundswell again from the bottom. Wondering if you'd care to incorporate that in your analysis. And also the fact again that a lot of domestic, policymakers, progressive and who look for a liberal system, are acknowledging the limits of redistributive policies in order to address this fundamental source of inequity. Thank you.
Who wants to weigh in on that?
I think it depends on where you sit, right? So if you sit and you look at, Trump and some of the opposition in Europe, then yes, this looks like an anti-globalization pushback started 20 years ago in Seattle round and has continued since then. If you sit in Asia, I'm not so sure. In some places maybe, and in some pockets, yes. Overall, I'm not completely convinced. I don't think you can argue that the entire globe is anti-trade. I don't think that that's the case. I think that there are groups who are worried about the implications of trade. In that trade bucket, we throw a lot of things. So in that trade bucket, increasingly is something called immigration. In that trade bucket is technological disruption. In that trade bucket is just fear of change. So a lot of things have gotten thrown into trade. Not everyone is equally worried about it. So I'm not convinced that the anti-globalization movement is as powerful as people suggest that it is. I think people are still interested in trade, even though it's morphing in different ways. So increasingly now people are potentially more interested in trade and services, more interested in trade in digital, more interested in other kinds of trade potentially than trade in physical things like they used to, the kinds of physical things they used to be interested in. And it depends on where you sit, how much pushback you get, and who you ask. So there are groups who are, adamantly opposed. I will be at the next RCEP round in Melbourne, where I am quite certain I will be. So RCEP is 16 countries here in Asia negotiating a trade agreement, and there are some, not very many, but there is a passionate group of NGOs now who are complaining about RCEP, and I'm sure that I will hear again how RCEP will, and I quote, kill every living green thing, every fish in the sea, every unborn baby, every female. What else have I heard? So the power, I mean, it goes on and on and on. And I just think to myself, wow, the power held in the hands of these officials is staggering. Like, if you could actually manage to affect the lives of every fish, animal, plant, human being, star in the sky, wouldn't that be amazing, right? Clearly that cannot be the case. So there is obviously a discontented group who thinks that this agreement will destroy everything. That cannot be the case. So there has to be something in between that and the reality. I don't know how far the balance, the fulcrum is. So I guess it depends on who you ask. Some people think it's going to destroy everything. Some people are like, please bring it on. I want more trade. And somewhere in between is where I think the reality lies.
Kimberly?
Yes, I think as the Davos woman, I have to respond, though they don't actually give me a ticket to Davos, but they give others them. The council that of this group of 20 experts, in a previous iteration, they did address this issue because it is an important one, and clearly globalization has led to some benefits and has not benefited all. I think we've seen the repercussions of that from 2008 onwards very starkly, but starting with Seattle, of course. They did publish a brief, a previous iteration, that mapped an inclusive trade agenda, looking at how trade policies, particularly things that are put forward either in a negotiation or even in domestic policy, could drive better outcomes for women, for small businesses, and the environment, so on and so forth. What do we do with that? Well, I think, where has the conversation evolved now? I think it's interesting to me watching this group discuss over the last year, because we've moved from global experts having a strong concern to build an inclusive trade agenda and to get it right, to moving to this stage where they feel like the baby literally is being thrown out with the bathwater. So we're throwing out, I mean, the appellate body is probably going to be gone by December at the WTO, which really calls into question the core foundations of the multilateral trading system, and so on and so forth, which I think then raises concern that some of the key economic efficiencies, in a sense, the benefit, before you even get to the redistribution part, the benefits are potentially going away, or the smaller benefits that you could argue, some would argue, come from trade. So the conversation has very much shifted now to what is this new context, how do you cooperate, and so on and so forth. I think it's interesting, though, and your question is very important, because I actually think over here on the tech disruption and on the sovereignty first, I think a lot of the drivers behind that are a sense of people being worried about jobs and worried about, well, how do I benefit in the future of the economy, which can also be stemming from concerns around digitalization, automation, and so on and so forth. So I think our work is not yet done, and we need to do a lot more. On the redistribution question specifically, I would say that not enough has been done, particularly in certain advanced economies. If you look at the US, where we are seeing a strong protectionist pushback, they spend far less on redistributive policies than they do on agriculture subsidies. So I think there's something to be said.
Amit?
And just a very small point to what Debbie and Kimberly mentioned, that I'm privileged at being between two very informed views, the Davos view and the greater world view on both sides. I'm just wondering that trade could be bad. What is better? I don't think we have an answer to that. When it comes to countries creating jobs, getting livelihoods for their people, what is a better solution? I mean, is not engaging in trade likely to give better results than engaging in trade? I don't think the agitators have a response to that. We are definitely worried about redistribution. I mean, it's pretty much like saying that WTO is terrible, but what is better? I don't think we have an answer to that. I mean, there are so many standards that we talk about saying as being terrible, but what is better, I think, is an answer which still eludes. So much as inclusive trade remains a work in progress. And there are many more developments that are left pending on that. I'm not too sure whether poor countries actually have an alternative to greater trade.
Thank you. I want to thank Deepinder for raising that very important question and the panelists for weighing in on that.
Can I just make one more
Sure,
point?
of course.
I would just make one more point. Even in the United States, which you might say, well, look at the Trump phenomenon, these people are anti-trade, support for trade has never been higher. So if you look at the polling data in the United States, the support for trade in the United States actually has gone up. So again, it depends on how you look at the numbers and who you ask, but overall, I would say that this sort of idea that trade is losing its appeal may be a bit overblown. Even in places that you would expect it to be diminishing, the numbers actually show the reverse.
Yeah, from the time of Adam Smith, we've learned that free trade is good for both trading partners. Even if one country is closed, it's good for both countries to trade, benefits both. But that thesis is being now nuanced and questioned about what countries need to do in order to fight the downside impact of free trade in terms of inequality, in terms of
But even then,
skills.
free trade was never going to benefit everyone equally. That was never part of the plan. Like there was never this like assumption that free trade would somehow like lead us all to nirvana. No. We were all in the long run, in the aggregate, everyone is better off. But in the short run, we are not all better off. And it depends on how long is long and how long is short. And in the aggregate, disguises a whole lot of lumpy variations. So if you're on the short end of the short stick, you're not very happy.
Yeah, I know. Talking about long run and short run, as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. So we worry about the short run.
Yeah.
But one thing, while on this, what strikes me is that for a long time, people who railed against globalization, free trade, were emerging and developing economies. In the 1970s and 80s, the grouse was that these multinationals are coming, they're plundering our resources, they're exploiting our labor, our natural environment, and they're taking away profits, and we get no benefit at all. But now tables have turned. It's the rich countries who are militating against globalization. It's America, Europe, and other countries. Anyway, lots of questions, lots of hands raised, but first I want to turn to our very distinguished colleague, Dr. Chowdhury.
Thank you. You exaggerate with this distinguished bit. Anyway, I'll begin with a big question that will be, and ask Kimberly a specific question. Big question, Amit, when you compared the trade war with the Cold War, I take your point that Cold War, the differentia was, it was ideologically driven, and this time it is not. A more apt analogy perhaps could be the what was called the continental blockade in the Napoleonic times, when Britain, Napoleon blocked trade with Britain and tried to take legal measures to implement that blockage. Now that led him to war with Spain, because he figured that a lot of trade was being carried out Spain and Russia, so there was war with Spain and war with Russia, and eventually the war with America, 1812 war, Britain and America, also owes its origin to this blockade because American ships were attacked in Sang, etc. Differentia here with the present times was that there wasn't a WTO in those days. Today, a week or so ago, Keith Rockwell was here. And you would know him. He was the great intellect during our time, but now I think he's director information or whatever. And he said, he painted a very sad picture of the state of the WTO at this point in time. And he said, because of the trade war, there have been 24 dispute settlement cases raised last year. And there is nothing that can be done about these, because these have been totally put out of action by the American position with regard to the WTO. Now, do you feel, is there a danger, and is this a sense that you get in Geneva, that the absence of the effectiveness of the WTO would lead to the trade war spinning out of control in a way that Europe had suffered in the last century because of it?
Okay. Big question. It's a risk, certainly. I think one of the things that has been on my mind and that I keep encouraging countries to think about is that it isn't a force that's in motion. So the appellate body not being able to function is one aspect. Sure, it's pretty significant if you have... There's still the DSP. There's what the EU is doing in proposing an alternative measures. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't go into that, but it is interesting. So I think the EU's move was particularly interesting because that was a very clear example of a group, a bloc, an economic bloc that has power, recognizing they have power and trying to change the conversation. Because the US is holding the AB over everyone's head because it can, and trying to negotiate with them on the AB is, in my view, not very useful because they'll continue to hold it over people's head until it's expired, and then they'll sit down to the negotiating table. Maybe they won't. I think there are some differences in the academic opinion as to whether they're using it as a negotiating tool or whether there's a fundamental shift in U.S. Thinking around sovereignty. Will Europe spin out? Will the global economy spin out of control? I don't know. I found it very interesting thinking back to a piece of work by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, who posited the Dell theory of conflict. So if two economies are so intertwined through their supply chains that you won't have conflict. But ironically, what we're seeing now is that when two economies are very intertwined through their supply chains, that becomes a weapon. So I don't have a good answer for you. I think I've just surfaced different variables to consider.
So
perhaps my other panelists have a better answer.
Uncontrolled spiral into self-destruction. Rani?
I was wondering if the panelists could bring geopolitics into the conversation a bit. In particular, when we're looking at what's currently happening in the Middle East. I'm wondering whether you could think through what the impact might be on this trade war. In particular, might there be a case that that there might be a recognition of the limits of these two countries engaging in trade war when the U.S. is having a hard time getting others to agree to their, pinpointing Iran as the culprit, right? Trying to build that coalition is looking difficult at this moment. So might scenarios such as what's happened in the Gulf show the limits of this trade war, particularly for the U.S.
Who of the panelists?
It should, but will it? No. No, because, so if you're asking about the U.S. administration in particular, this is not a normal U.S. administration. This is not an administration that necessarily has rational decision-making or decision-making that is handled through the sort of interagency process that would lead other folks to weigh in and say, hey, you people over here should maybe think about what you're doing because it's conflicting with what we're doing over here. Like that sort of coordination is not happening in this White House. So because that coordination is not happening, what you have are different independent actors who are off doing their own thing. And the result of that is they're all doing their own thing without any sort of thinking through, well, what would make the most sense? And yeah, it might very well make a lot more sense if you actually had some more cooperation in different areas, but that would require cooperation and coordination, which doesn't happen internally and is not part of the thought process externally at all. So no, I don't think that would happen, not under this administration.
Raymond, I have a question for you. We are from ASEAN and South Asia at the center of our universe. You know, this global value chains As you said, there is going to be a process of adjustment depending on how countries see this, study this, whether it's temporary, permanent, etc., and how it might all readjust. But so far, we understand that to the extent that end assembly has shifted, it shifted to 3 countries only: Korea, Vietnam, and which one? Taiwan? Taiwan, Korea, and Vietnam.
Taiwan,
yeah. But this is a big opportunity for South Asia. South Asia has been out of the GVC, but how do countries in South Asia manage to get into this GVC and exploit this space that is being vacated by China?
I don't think that's the short answer, and maybe a bit of a flippant one. I don't think it's going to happen in this lifetime.
That's very disappointing.
It is, yes. But unfortunately, that's the situation I think many of us have encountered in any organization or any client that I've worked with. Whenever we've looked at restructuring our supply chain, or even dealing with our colleagues. And I've run businesses in Asia for a number of years. Everyone talks about Japan and Korea being 2 very different countries compared to the rest of the Asia-Pacific region. And then very often we avoid India altogether. Why? It's a market that somehow, for many reasons, and even we see this in RCEP, it's a market that has a lot of demands, but also doesn't like to accede a lot.
Doesn't like to concede?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was at a intellectual property global standards event just this morning, and the speaker was from India. He's the head of the Indian Intellectual Property Coalition or Association. And he said, you know, the only thing that India likes to export is its people, and imports a lot. But when you talk about participation of mutual recognition, so on and so forth, it is a challenge. So that, yeah, will India step in to replace China instead of, say, Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, or even Thailand? From where I'm standing, looking at how businesses operate and think, India's not even on the radar for them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe a disappointing answer, but that's what I see when we look at businesses.
I hope Prime Minister Modi is hearing. Yeah.
Yes.